hello to everyone. So I'm very happy to give a little impulse, perhaps. I think it's going to be a brief masterclass, as you call it, right? So we have 10 minutes or so, and then about another 10 for questions and answers. Right. So let me see. The share button is here. I hope that you're now all able to see a full screen. Here we go. Before I start, I'd like to make you aware of a very nice meeting that's going to happen in Mainz in September. That's our annual international symposium on resilience research, highly recommendable. Lots of great stuff, lots of great input. And let's jump directly into the matter. So in our work, we define resilience as an outcome, meaning if somebody, and I now hope that you will be able to see my laser pointer. Yes. So if someone goes into a difficult phase of their life, a lifetime of adversity, and that person would kind of end up in terms of their mental health roughly somewhere here, so more or less similar to how they started going into that phase, maybe after a brief disturbance, but in the end ending up somewhere here. So we would say, just empirically, just from an observation, that's a resilient person, as opposed to people who start to develop lasting impairments during such a hard phase of their life. And then we are asking, are there perhaps predictors of such good long-term mental health outcomes, which we then call resilience factors, is something that predicts that somebody would rather be here than up there. And we also speak of resilience mechanisms. So resilience mechanisms are things that people do, or people's bodies do, or behaviors that people show during exposure to an acute stressor, and that somehow helps them to optimize their stress responses to levels that don't lastingly exhaust someone and lead to allostatic load and overload effects. And the relationship between these acute, if you wish, performances or acts of coping and those predictors or predispositions is that, at least in theory, a resilience factor would be something that makes it more likely that a resilience mechanism, so a kind of adaptive style, adaptive way of coping, is activated. So imagine someone has a certain emotion regulation style or capacity that would be a resilience factor, and that perhaps leads to that person actually using such adaptive emotion regulation strategies during a phase of exposure. So that's the very general outline, very conceptual general outline. And perhaps from these graphs, you can already guess that if you want to study this, what you need are prospective longitudinal designs, right? You need to look at people over time. So in the simplest possible scenario, let's imagine you've measured somebody's mental health problems at time point T1, then that person undergoes a difficult phase, is exposed to stresses, and you measure their mental health again at another time point. What you will observe is that some people get worse, develop more problems. You will also observe that some people stay stable and other individuals sometimes, rarely even improve. So you could say, well, these people up here have more problems, have developed more problems over the time, and so they are less resilient than these people down here. Well, not quite. Just imagine you have someone showing this kind of behavior here, and that person has maybe, let's talk about an adult example. They've lost their job, they've lost their partner. As a function of this, they've developed severe financial problems and maybe even developed a physical disease. And then you have somebody down here who's now, I'm a bit provocative, but maybe the worst thing that's happened to them was they were not invited to a party. Okay, so obviously, I mean, this is just to illustrate that it doesn't make sense to just compare these outcomes. You're comparing apples and pears. What you need to do is you need to also measure the stressor exposure, quantify that somehow, and then put the development of mental health problems in relation to the load, the burden that somebody has experienced. So somehow you need, in order to speak about resilience as an outcome, you need to normalize to the stresses. And this is just an example of what we've been doing, for instance, in a study in young adults. So we've been sending them every 3 months over many years questionnaires that were asking about the life events they've been experiencing in the past 3 months, for instance, daily hassles that they typically experience. And then in the same service, we've also asked them about their mental health status, right? So we've been able to look at changes in mental health and relating this to their stress exposure as a general principle. And what you can do, for instance, with this type of data, and maybe you can also do this in the study that you are doing in FORTEe, is that, for instance, look at here, we are averaging somebody's stress exposure across these life events and the smaller micro stresses, the daily hassles. We are quantifying that. We are putting that in relation to their average mental health problems across a similar time point. So this would be, or time interval, this would be the first 9 months of their participation in the study. You can see there's a relationship, which is great. Otherwise, there's no point really talking about resilience in the first place. And then you can do something like this. You can look at an individual's residual onto that normative relationship, that regression between the stressors and the mental health problems in that study population or study sample. And you will see that some people have more than expected, more than predicted mental health problems, of worse problems, and others have less. And you can use that residual as a quantification. And that's a pretty elegant thing. So you can compare these two people. That person is obviously, in those terms, a bit less resilient than that person here on the greener side of life. You can do that for number 3 and number 4 as well, but you can now also, for instance, compare 3 and 1 and 3 and 2, right? Although these two persons have different levels of stress exposure, by using that residual, you now have a kind of normalization that allows you to compare individuals with differences in stress exposure. This is also an illustrative example. If you just looked at their mental health problems as such raw mental health problems, you would say these people are equally bad. Right? They have quite severe mental health problems. But if you consider that that person, number 5, he had more exposure, then their residual is smaller, and you can say, well, they are perhaps a bit less non-resilient than that person. So you have this nice way of quantifying things. We call this the stressor activity score, and ideally, what you want to have a lower negative stressor activity score. Right, so let's see if we can use that to identify resilience factors. Yes, we can. This is the answer. So here, for instance, we've been measuring in a baseline battery that we've gone all our subjects through a certain variable, positive appraisal style, PAS, whatever that is. And we do see that now with data for 3+ years that we've been able to analyze, we see that this predicts a very long-term SR score, right, over more than 3 years, which approximates this definition of resilience as a good long-term mental outcomes. They predict a negative SR score with quite a high explained variance. We see that also in another data set, in a broader age range, a bigger data set. So there is this PAS, this positive appraisal style, according to this logic, can be considered a resilience factor. We see that association with a negative SR score, sometimes cross-sectionally, but in most cases longitudinally also, very consistent in all the studies where we've been testing that. And just to highlight that this is probably even a causal factor. So in this particular study, which we've conducted throughout the COVID pandemic in healthcare workers in Spain, we see that an intervention that we apply based on a WHO program reduces over time compared to a control group the stressor reactivity scores. It suggests the intervention is a pro-resilience intervention. And we also see that it enhances strongly this positive appraisal style variable from time point to time point. And we do see that the effect of the intervention on positive appraisal style here at this time point prospectively mediates the effect on that stressor reactivity score. So we can use an intervention to change positive appraisal style, and that appears to change resilience towards the better. There's more RCTs ongoing that we're currently analyzing. So we have this probably causal resilience factor. And now what is this positive appraisal style? So the idea is that this is a typical way of evaluating, interpreting stresses in terms of what they mean for you, for your long-term well-being, for your needs, for your goals. And the idea is that If you have a very unrealistically and overly negative appraisal style, meaning you catastrophize, you're very pessimistic, you estimate your coping potential as very low, then this will lead to overreactions. This will lead to strong stress reactions when you're exposed, and that will make it likelier that you will develop allostatic load effects and you will get exhausted. You also do not want to have an extremely unrealistic positive way of appraising things, because that means you never really develop stress reactions, although you should, right? Stress reactions are in the first place necessary and adaptive to cope with the challenges that life puts to us. So you kind of want to be in the realistic range, and maybe you want to be a little bit to the right of that realistic, a little bit, not with super rosy glasses, but sometimes go through life with a little bit of overestimation of the likelihood of getting a bad, underestimation of the likelihood to get a negative outcome, underestimation about the possible costs or magnitude of that outcome, maybe overestimating your coping potential a little bit. And there's evidence that suggests that this kind of makes it easier for you to cope with things and develop coping potential, also to recreate, rebuild resources in times of no acute stress exposure. So kind of half rosy glasses going through this to life with this kind of approach and attitude towards evaluating stressors, that seems to be adaptive. So that's the positive appraisal style. And another idea about this construct is that, well, there's so many resilience factors that have been described on different levels, right? So social support seems to be very important. Socioeconomic status, a genotype can have influences, spirituality, perhaps availability of green spaces, gender as a factor, personality, immune function, certain features of your brain, functional architecture, etc., etc. They all seem to influence outcome, the resilience outcome. And now the idea is that in the end, they all shape the way that you approach stressors, that you evaluate or appraise stressors. So the idea is that positive appraisal style is an integrative resilience factors that kind of takes up the influences of all these more distal resilience factors and essentially then finally shapes the way that you deal with stresses. And we actually do see this mediating relationship for that kind of example. For instance, here social support makes PAS more positive, and that seems to then turn you into a less stress reactive person. So we see that mediating relationship again in all the studies where we've tested that. So we believe that this is a kind of integrative resilience factor, and just to kind of finalize that link then, or make that link get to the end. So in the end, PAS shapes resilience because when you're then confronted with an acute stressor, it helps you actually appraise these stressors more positively. And I'm not going to go into all details because time is running out. I think I'm already over time. So we do see that in this study, for instance, and that's all I'm going to say about this study. So that's kind of closing the link between resilience factors, resilience mechanisms, and then the outcome of resilience. I was also asked to say a little bit about resilience factors in children with cancer. I'd like to push that into the Q&A session. First, because I'm not an expert in this field at all. And then when looking into literature, I was pretty disappointed. And so I stop here. I thank you very much for your attention. And I keep all the rest then for a discussion in the Q&A. Thanks a lot.